Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E Silva. Today, we're speaking with Jonathan Dotan. Jonathan is a fellow at Stanford's Center for Blockchain Research and the Stanford Compression Forum. He researches and lectures on applied strategy and policy for the decentralized web and co-founded the Starling Initiative. He has over 20 years of experience navigating the intersections of media, tech, and policy. Jonathan recently wrapped up 6 seasons writing and producing HBO's Emmy Award-winning series, Silicon Valley. And now, over to the interview with Jonathan Dotan. Yeah, so we got a chance to talk a few weeks ago and get acquainted. And of course, you were on the private virtual summit just a few weeks ago. So thanks a lot for doing that. You've been spending a lot of time with Orchid, the Orchid community recently.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And yeah, no problem. Thanks for. I mean, you did a really deep dive there on at the virtual summit into your area of research, but hopefully we can have a broader conversation today, a little bit more about your background. You've actually done some really interesting stuff, so we'll get that on the record here, whatever you're comfortable sharing, and without burning anybody, obviously.
Sure.
We don't want to start a sushi dumpster fire like it's been happening this week with the sushi DAO, but
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
for people who, yeah, that's okay. For people who missed the private virtual summit or maybe aren't familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background, Jonathan, and what inspired your interest in, I think, what is ultimately some really fundamental level blockchain research?
Yeah, it's a kind of an uncanny story, and I've always spent time at the intersection of media and technology. And for a while, I kind of hated myself in the way. I was like, all right, I'm gonna choose one or the other. But I kept on finding that I'm just this mutt, and I need to kind of accept that. And so that's taken me on a journey really all over the world. I worked in 30 countries on behalf of the U.S. studios, working on local market development.
Wow.
I worked in private equity in places like India, in having a technology portfolio and also a media portfolio. But I'd say that, like, really, when I think about the stuff that's always mattered to me the most, it has been around human rights issues, and that got started as when I worked first as an engineer, and got a chance to really think about the underpinnings of the internet as a front end engineer, and thinking about how this type of technology could really democratize a lot of things for artists and for activists. And that really was the genesis of my career, and I wrote about that as an undergrad. And then and I worked at startups in Web 1.0, so I got that kind of wild ride that was there. And then I also spent time working for the United Nations out in Bosnia for some really formative experiences working on accountability issues with, well, it was some pretty crazy organized criminal activity in the region. And so those things, while they were the anchor of the beginning of my career, I always felt a longing, kind of several, well, I guess it was like 2 decades later, to say, how can I get back to that? And when Web3 started, I recognized that this was really the opportunity. And how I came to Web3, which is kind of a fun story, was that I was working as a writer and producer on HBO's television show, Silicon Valley. And if you've seen the show, basically what it is it's like a kind of a torture chamber for putting these startup founders in. And we said, okay, for 6 seasons, how can we continually torture them to kind of let their startup see another day, but not succeed per se.
Which is,
right?
At least for some, that's pretty much what Silicon Valley is like.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of listeners here would say, oh, sure, that's Monday, right?
Yeah.
And so we were trying to brainstorm ways in which our protagonist Richard could use his compression technology to do something really fundamentally changing the roadmap of technology. And I stumbled across this article, which was from Bram Cohen's work on Project Maelstrom. Bram was one of the founders of BitTorrent, and he had put this idea together of how could they use the BitTorrent technology to host HTML files, and to really think of a way in which you would decentralize the storage of websites so that they could be censorship resistant. And I thought, wow, that is super cool. And if you combine that with Richard's amazing compression technology, like, then what would happen, right? It would be this really cool internet that would be basically hosted on people's mobile phones. And really, that's all you need.
Yeah.
You wouldn't need AWS. You wouldn't need like all these massive monopolies controlling the the discovery and the storage of information. Like, it sounded really cool. And as we got deeper into it, we realized, oh my gosh, this is actually like a real thing. And the writers, as I was talking about them, they got excited, but they said we need time. And so that was around season 2 when we started really thinking about the idea. Several seasons later, the internet is like on fire, right? It's this crazy situation in which, the election may have gotten tossed by stuff that was going on with, misinformation that was online. And when we began the show, Zuckerberg was on a short list of people for the Nobel Peace Prize. And by the time we ended the show, he's showing up in Congress, effectively as a convicted felon in the court of public opinion, right?
Right.
So it was really a question is like, well, then how can we think about this technology as potentially a new era for the web? And lucky enough, Web3 was at that time taking off. And so, we did token sales on the show, right? There was a Pied Piper token sale. At the time, I was also
I haven't finished the series yet, so
okay.
I've missed that. But I'm not gonna get angry for spoiling things. So it's I haven't worked in Silicon Valley, but I knew enough people or was adjacent or following the careers of people who were. And so a lot of the first, I think, 2 or 3 seasons wherever I left off there, mostly because I didn't have access to HBO. And so I was not always watching it by the most ethical of means.
The alternative web, I guess. Okay, got it.
I mean, like, I'm not paying $40 a month for one show, right? Anyway, I very much recognize, like, oh my God, I've been reading about this life for eons now. At least it felt like eons, from 14, 15 years old, messing around with Angel Fire, websites and learning HTML, hating CSS and JavaScript, appreciating other programming languages or frameworks like PHP and stuff like that. And working side by side with all sorts of developers and reading TechCrunch. I was like, oh my God, like I've seen so many people go through these exact scenarios. This is a slightly blown up version, but it's like, for me, it was really clear, like, that's Google or Facebook, in this show, like that's like that's who this person is. Peter Thiel was brought up a lot as I think the CEO of the antagonist company. The name escapes me at the moment. Hooli, never mind.
Gavin Belson.
And
the
Gavin Belson,
but,
yes.
But, they were really all composites of different characters, and that's what made them so much fun, was that it wasn't a one-to-one biopic. What we could do is take like a bunch of crazy and pack it into one character, and that ultimately ended up being much more satisfying because the stuff is nuts, right? I mean, the majority of the writing process was driven by research, so we would just go out and listen as much as we possibly could. I had, on any given season, I had about probably around 200 people or so that we would bring into the writing process who were kind of real life Silicon Valley folks. And my team would sit there and find ways of integrating them to get information. And that was anything from like a question of, hey, like, how does this type of thing work? Or did we say this correctly? Like, could we actually convince an engineer that, Guilfoyle would talk like this, or that, Richard's, next generation of his tech actually would stand muster with like a VC, so those types of things were interesting. And as we, in retrospect now, I guess it's so clear that we were early with what we now call Web3. Because at the time that we were talking about decentralized technologies, first and foremost, it was almost all cryptocurrency led at that point. So Ethereum was on its way up, and we were starting to see that ecosystem blossom, but it was still really early. So it was exciting to think about the second and third steps of this type of revolution, and to say, okay, if cryptocurrencies have created a whole new set of infrastructure and incentive, and now crypto utilities are coming in to build a baseline of decentralized infrastructure. Okay, now, what's next, right? What would people use this type of thing for? And arguably Pied Piper was, in the vanguard on that.
So did that pretty much directly lead to starting Project Starling and the work you're doing there? And whether or not please elaborate on what Project Starling is for everybody listening.
Sure. So, yeah, let me talk to you a little bit about the lab. So, the Starling Lab was founded at the USC Show-Off Foundation and Stanford's Department of Electrical Engineering. And we are researching how cryptography and distributed systems can preserve the integrity and the privacy of online data for three groups: historians, lawyers, and journalists, as they make their way onto Web3. Because we want to make sure that their interests are properly represented in the technology roadmaps and that they can really take advantage of what could potentially be really game-changing technology for those industries. So rather than reacting to the web as it is and as it's been adopted, we wanted to make sure that they got in on the ground floor and those voices were properly represented in the tech discussions. So that's the lab. It's super exciting because we actually deploy in the field. And today, hopefully, we can talk a little bit about stuff that we've done where it's real life technology that's out there and being tested and pulled upon. And we get to see how this stuff works, how it breaks, et cetera.
Right.
That type of approach really resonated with me as somebody who worked as a C-level executive in various technology companies and as an investor. So I wanted to keep a startup-like approach. And at the same time, I wanted a chance to think. I know that sounds strange, but here's, when you work in an environment like, well, in that case, it was a fast-paced TV show that we were writing on a really aggressive schedules, or at the time I was also working at a startup. And so we did a token sale and, we were releasing technology on a pretty fervent pace. You embrace technology and the opportunity for things as you see it, because you're like, well, we could do this and this and this, and you work really quickly on it.
Right.
But you really are not thinking deeply about what are the choices that you are making, like what are the ethical foundations of what you have, and that I think we've now with Web 2 come to see that type of really aggressive, lean approach to startup is really interesting in testing out technology. It may not necessarily be the best way to think about the ethics behind technology, because that takes some time. That takes some real deep thinking. And so I pressed pause on a lot of my work and got a chance to spend 3 months putting together a course at the Stanford's Graduate School of Business to think about Web3 and what's next for the re-architecting of the internet. And as I got through with that research, I started to realize, there's the basis here, not just for a class, that was the beginning of something really cool, but also a research lab. And that's really how Starling came to be. And we got lucky. Had the belief of folks like Dan Bonet at Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, Tucky Weissman, who's head of the Stanford Compression Forum. They really took this on because they saw it resonated with their own research and the incredible work that their students were already doing. And then also we got a chance to work with the USC Show-Off Foundation. And for listeners who don't know much about it, the Show-Off Foundation was started 30 years ago to collect the testimony of the survivors of genocide. So they have 55,000 survivors' testimonies are in an archive now that has been very carefully curated and put together by these historians to ensure that we never forget the tragedies that have unfolded with genocide and systemic violence. So that data set actually is a really powerful data set and also a very vulnerable data set, right? There'd be a lot of governments and people that would want that type of thing to just disappear.
For sure.
And decentralized technologies, if you think about it, they're actually like a really good fit for how you might want to store this type of vulnerable data set. Because instead of relying, let's say, on one data center, let's call it like, some sort of region of an Amazon, instance.
Not
right?
US East 1.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's some trying times in that world. Well, right. I mean, that's what it's showing you, right? Is if we rely on one company to do all this work, or for that matter, just a region of their servers, the data is totally vulnerable. And so what we want to do is find a way to decentralize this and enjoy the benefits of a diverse topology of network nodes, right? So everything from enterprise servers, which are great and have uptime and secure facilities, all the way to something like a mobile phone that would allow individuals, activists, like people like you and I, right, to say, hey, we want to stand up and we want to preserve this critical history, and we're willing to lend both our storage, so the hard drives that are there, but then also with
Yeah.
cryptography, we can lend our compute to help seal this type of information into a record and make it immutable.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering from that is you got to take a really nice break from the move fast and break things approach that Facebook is famous for. It seems like they're exactly what you mentioned. Learning the lessons that doesn't work. It's led to far more problems than they probably anticipated at the time, or almost certainly anticipated, because I think they anticipated very few, if any. Francis Haugen's release of a lot of internal research, I think, has borne that out. Whether
Mm-hmm.
you think it should have been released or not, and whether Mark Zuckerberg thinks that there's not enough context there, I think some of it speaks for itself. Where if you don't think much about the consequences, um, you know, teenagers' mental state can be affected more than being a teenager already affects it,
Right.
and more than the normal pressures of being a teenager or somebody in your early 20s, can get to you with all that's changing in your life at the time, just compounded exponentially by all these digital experiences that were designed to be super fun and amazing, and instead, like any technology, can be used for ill, or can have a negative impact if used improperly or poorly. So yeah, it's not everybody certainly gets 3 months to think deeply about
Right.
that sort of thing. So that's great that you took the time, obviously took it seriously, and decided to actually do something about it instead of just, oh well, I'm going to teach this really cool course. Great first step, but actually putting something into action is certainly far more admirable. So thanks for doing that, and it's great you're able to find some support in and amongst Stanford and the Shoah Foundation. You mentioned historians in that bit. There is one of the um, core interests for Starling Labs. Uh, Actually, I think you just kind of expanded on some examples there. Genocide, obviously, a really big one.
Mm-hmm.
The past 100 years has given us quite a few opportunities to examine that particular topic. Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about and because I voiced something at the time, I didn't quite get the three core constituents. So you had historians in there, and who are the other two?
So journalists and also lawyers. And
Gotcha.
they,
Okay.
and this came about like really organically, right? So you think about accountability to some extent, right? The historians do the first draft of some of that work, or pardon, journalists do the first draft of that work. So we wanted to make sure that we
Right. Yeah.
started with them. Historians kind of pick up and start to very carefully piece together the narrative that hopefully, will stir a debate and people over time come to understand what actually happened in that time period better. And then lawyers work with they work often with the same material, but they have to admit it into evidence. And the process of admission of those types of materials is quite complicated, and that needs to be sorted out for the courts to be able to accept the
Right.
information.
Um, is Starling Labs actually like maybe not curating, but like structuring this data in such a way that it's easier for journalists, I guess, to input, historians to access, lawyers to access in formats that they need best? Or is it still mostly manual for them to be like, okay, I need this little bit and I'm going to put it into this court filing form or what have you?
Yeah, so let me give you a sense of how this all began. Is it started with storage, which is a really intuitive idea, right? We want to decentralize storage because we want it to be more resilient. And
Right.
once the files hit that storage, we now have a chain of custody, right? That's what the blockchain technologies allow us to do. But then we realized that we could actually start upstream from storage, and we could think a little bit about, with cameras, how they could establish a chain of custody actually within the camera itself. So within mobile phones or professional grade cameras, there are things you can do to actually lock an image and also lock in the metadata. So you can establish the
Yes.
time and the date, the place in which a photograph was taken. So that was great.
So
So
that
we,
the XF data is not modified after the fact. And if it's on a mobile phone, it's got GPS. that's the spot. Nobody's changing it later.
You got it. Exactly. So those types of things, if they are controlled by the photographer, that's very important because you don't want to put them at risk. But if they can make that choice to disclose that information, we want to ensure that those attestations are locked in. So that's upstream from storage. And then downstream from storage, once I have the objects, I still need to analyze them to understand their veracity. So that image might be looked at one way by a newspaper editor. It might be evaluated differently by a lawyer, or let's say an activist, and each of them can form attestations that create a web of knowledge around an image. And then as an end reader, I now have a way of establishing for myself, like, well, first of all, here's this unbroken chain of custody. So I know through capture, storage, and verification that nothing has changed with the image. And then I can start to get some context. So I can evaluate like what actually is going on right in the image. And that became a framework that guided our work. So it's 3 steps: capture, store, and verify. And at each of those steps, we found that different cryptographic tools were relevant to those separate processes. And in fact, we could actually register the information on different chains because each of those chains do things differently with respect to consensus. You might want a private permission chain in certain circumstances where there are vulnerabilities on safety and operational security or enterprise trust considerations, et cetera. Or you might want a public chain that's permissionless to do registration of information like hashes, where they're essentially it's a one-way piece of information. So, there's no real inherent risk in publishing a hash, but you have now an immutable record of that hash, so you can audit essentially the validity of the information. So those types of things, like it was once it became clear that there were 3 steps, then it all just expanded exponentially from there because we realized there were so many different technologies that we can integrate. And readers and folks that we talked to about the potential for seeing this tech, their eyes kind of glazed over. They're like, this is too much. Like this can't possibly be the way in which I digest the front page photo, on the NewYorkTimes.com, right? So we needed to think about intuitive ways of presenting this information. And so that's a whole UX exploration. And that became a guiding principle for us in a way, is that as excited as we are about this technology and we want to use it and go really deep, we also want to have iconic, clear, and intuitive case studies so that people can understand why this matters. Because otherwise we're just sitting there in engineering land and, developing tech for tech's sake. Like, we really want to resonate with people. And what we found was that historians, journalists, and lawyers, they're not engineers by training for the most part. And so the dialogue with them to say, okay, here's what a cryptographic hash is and how it was generated. If we could connect that to, and here's what that means when you're standing in front of a judge, or here's what it means when you're trying to preserve, history for 400 years in an archive. Those types of dialogues were not common, but they were so exciting because people saw that both sides essentially had a really important role to play.
And what comes to mind right now is I'll visit twitter.com, just, land and see my timeline, and it feels like every day right now, if not multiple times a day, there's a different trending story or whatever in the corner about how this picture of Kamala Harris has been doctored according to fact checkers, or this video of people running away from something has been digitally altered. And I'm like, I'm not even clicking because I don't pay attention to those sorts of situations that are happening online. I'm very much focused on blockchain, cryptocurrency, my family, and that's really about it, and some local news because
what priority, Derek?
Obviously, in my
what's the rank there?
Kamala Harris and the U.S. presidency as vice presidency as a Canadian, very low. I don't follow conspiracy theories or QAnon. Like, I know what QAnon is, and I know, the potential impact it had during the last couple of elections and stuff like that. But like, I'm not in the weeds on that stuff. So I'm not one of those people who's like looking for these potentially controversial situations or photos or videos of influential people. It's just not my thing. But obviously, there's, Twitter's being used to spread it. I'm sure Facebook is as well. I think we all know that. And so I'm thinking of like, this is a great opportunity for this technology to be embedded in there, because even Photoshop or Adobe is now embedding the ability for like a digital artist to cryptographically write their data as a non-fungible token at the source.
Yep.
And then mint it on whatever platform. So like, to me, this is the more significant historical version of that sort of thing, where like you said, that photographers actually capturing the source, potentially adding some context of their own and what they were feeling and what they were seeing at the time, back to like the photojournalist potentially paired with a journalist who's also going to provide their perspective, and then downward through the stream. So I think that's really, really important, obviously for historical reasons, and potentially to help prevent the sorts of situations we're seeing now from blowing up as much as they do.
Right.
You're always going to have people who are like, I don't believe you. So it doesn't, like it's not foolproof by any means, but anything that helps, I think anything that helps verify the veracity of information being presented without an opportunity to even try to mess with it in the first place, when it is something, so important as like POTUS is dead or something like that. Not wishing for that, Mr. Biden. Yeah, I think it's really important. But as you said, how you present that in the user experience, in the interfaces, if it's going to go out to the public, especially, is incredibly important, because almost no one is going to, you could get 0.05% or something of people who are going to like dig in and be like,
Sure.
I want to actually check all the way down.
Right. Well, let's think about this example, because I think underlying what you're saying is really something that we've, I think, all experienced now, which is that we live in a photographic age, and to see something is really to believe it. And so if we place a lot of trust in photographs, and then they can be sent around the world within a matter of seconds, well, then we really have to ask ourselves a question: what is required at the moment to make this all possible? And so I want to think about that level of trust, and maybe we try to create like an idea around this, which is that really the goal then is just to reduce information uncertainty. What we're trying to establish is that we have, if some information has gone from point A to point B, it hasn't been tampered with, and we know who has said what. That's it. Let's just start with those basics before we get into some crazy idea like the truth, right? Which is a much more complicated thing, right? To establish actually what really happened and all that, right? But instead we say...
I still appreciate truthiness from the old Colbert Report.
Yeah, exactly, right.
It was a fun...
We'll leave
so
that to
prescient, though.
We'll leave that, to those experts. But what we can start with is the basics. And so once, if you think a little bit about it, the underlying challenge is, in the case you presented, is how can you have that photograph have authenticity markers within it, so we know that it has been properly sealed and hashed in some sort of way, essentially. And then how can those markers actually stay with the photograph? Because as it moves around, the biggest challenge that exists on Web 2 right now is that you upload a photograph to Twitter and immediately the EXIF data is removed. So we've lost, even if we had that information, it's now gone. And then it goes and it spreads all over the world. So there's been a deficit with the transfer of things like images because of some choices that were made by major social media platforms to remove EXIF information out of a fear that basically any of those fields could be sites for vectors of malware. And I get that argument. I think it made sense at the time. But now there's clearly, it's worth revisiting this. And that's where Twitter has stepped up along with the New York Times and Adobe to think of ways where we could take JPEGs and include in the header information of that file exactly the types of things that we're talking about today. Authenticity markers from Web3 to prove registrations on different chains, basic information like time and date and the photographer, caption, all those types of things are now being understood as really critical to the photograph, and that they want to, we should keep it with the photograph. And so that's that standard that you were talking about is now with the Linux Foundation, and there's a cohort of around 500 organizations that have joined up to try to help really create that standard. And hopefully,
Awesome.
Twitter will be able to implement it such that when photographs are uploaded from a trusted source that uses this type of framework, that they can then inject information into there. And in theory, like, we should be good. Misinformation is over, like, roll credits, like, happily ever after, right? Um, and and I can tell you that it's obviously not what's going to happen, but let me share it to you why. The fear with all of this from those of us in the human rights world is that this type of authentication technology can be used for good from trusted sources, but it could also be used by antagonists in this system to create a lot of noise and misinformation. It's open source, right?
Right.
So anybody can use it. And then here's the thing that is probably the most disconcerting is that in the rush to adopt this type of technology, what we're seeing is that there's a lot of discussions with people that are developing firmware. And that is complicated because now if you include authenticity markers and hashing and signing at the firmware level, that means users are potentially not really going to have as much choice with that. It could be flipped on by a telecom, or it could be flipped on by a mobile device manufacturer, and you might not know.
Right.
And if you have to opt out of that type of thing as a citizen, that might be really tricky because I don't know how to. I don't even know how to change firmware settings, on my device. Right? That's not something I normally access. So for a while, we've been super excited and we've participated. We can give you great examples about how this has worked and how it's deployed. And then we at the same time, we've also kept ourselves thinking, and our security research uncovered that it turns out that North Korea, for the last decade, has actually implemented very similar authentication technology so that mobile phones that are officially allowed within North Korea can authenticate images and to link them back to devices to establish time and date and what device took the information. And you can
Oh boy.
imagine, right, that
Yeah.
that government doesn't necessarily have the same objectives as some other governments. And so what
Right.
was originally like a very abstract fear actually became very concrete. And ironically, North Korea has a 10-year head start on us with respect to authenticated
Hmm.
imagery. They go one step further to illustrate the danger. They also have an approved set of hashes for media that the government has determined is okay for its citizens to see. And so if you have certain offending images that are, let's say, not on that list, if you download or sideload that information onto your mobile phone with this thing they call the Red Star OS, which is a fork of Android, the files get automatically deleted on the device, so you can't
Oh,
actually
wow.
watch that. You can't even continue to store it. So this is not. This is really complicated stuff. Is that we think we've kind of sorted it out and have this kind of silver bullet for dealing with misinformation, and yet other types of governments and companies even might have a very different type of view about how they could use the tech. And so that's why we think a research center is so important, is because for us, like, Web3 is not a destination that we've kind of arrived at as this utopia. Instead, it's really just an opportunity. And all of us, if we really believe in the power of this technology to do good, have to stay thinking and figure out what are
Yeah.
the vulnerabilities with it, because it could all go horribly wrong really quickly.
Yeah, well, I guess that just illustrates, one of those situations where a nonprofit or a foundation or a lab that doesn't necessarily have the need to commercialize, um, there's the benefit, right? You actually do get the time to pause and think and do some research and find out, hey, this has actually already been done, but in the worst way possible or one of the worst ways possible. So that's I I try to give them more credit. I try to give North Korea more credit than most people do. I certainly don't write them off as a non-threat in any situation. And yet, I wouldn't have thought that they were that far ahead on this sort of thing. It makes sense in a way, because that how else do you control the message so tightly when through a mix of happenstances, you might get a VPN to somebody, or you might get a third part, a stray LTE connection over the DMZ. um, and what do you do with that? Well, even if you do, and you get a signal from Seoul, they're still going to make sure you're not seeing, the North Korean government's going to make sure you're not seeing anything they don't want you to see. So
They're
that is
trying.
some next level um, Black Mirror type stuff.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like it's I guess that's the successor, I guess the Silicon Valley might be like, season 4 or whatever of Black Mirror. I mean, in a sense, I mean, to be honest, like that really dawned on us as we were writing the last season, was how dramatically things had changed. And, without giving away spoilers as to how the series ends in that season, how that season begins with Richard being interviewed or giving testimony in front of the United States Senate. So, it's, I don't think that was how we would have assumed when we started in season 1 that, our big opening act, for season 6 would begin with Richard in front of Congress. Like, that's insane. And yet that's the table stakes of the world that we live in right now, right? It's that these
Yeah.
technologies have had a disproportionate effect on us. However, what I like to remind people, and hopefully it resonates with the listeners here, is that probably the biggest problem was what we did as consumers in pinning these unrealistic expectations on the technology, right? Because the VCs had their role and the entrepreneurs, had their role as well. But as consumers, we fed into this narrative that we really desperately wanted to believe in, which is that this was kind of the end of history. And that as Web 2.0 was taking over, I would have friends all over the world. We could disintermediate publishers and governments. And so therefore the truth could somehow proliferate on places like Twitter and whatnot. And it's, the biggest challenge there was the euphoria. It was this notion that somehow these technology platforms could do this. And then, of course, we were horribly betrayed through that process.
Yeah.
I think now in the techlash, people are starting to turn and ask really important questions around what are the financial incentives that got us to this point, and how have the companies and the architecture of these companies, both from a corporate architecture standpoint as well as a technical architecture, like what's wrong with that, right? So that's the whole idea around decentralization. But I want to make sure that we introduce also that really important inquiry that needs to happen, which is also, but what is it that was delusional about our thinking in general? Right? Like what was the problem with believing that, let's say, Facebook was going to overthrow dictators? And if we get to the heart of that, then I think we also can level set a little bit more about what the future of Web 3.0 could be. Because it's not going to just solve poverty, authoritarian regimes, censorship. It has the capability to impact those types of discussions. However, it is not deterministic, nor is it necessarily a comprehensive solution by any means. And so it's incumbent on us to all just get real, and to ensure that as we get excited about the tech, that we don't become delusional like we did before.
Yeah. I mean, the Great Firewall of China blocks access to all the major Ethereum RPC servers or services. Like, just because the technology exists doesn't mean you can access it. And yes, you need a VPN, but the fact that VPN is usable in China almost certainly means that the government sanctions it, and therefore they know exactly what's going on. And you think you're getting a little bit of freedom, but in the end, they could still shut that VPN down, or get the VPN to block additional services if they really, really want to, while still appearing super tough on the outside, even if they are allowing certain kinds of traffic in between. Like, there's so much nuance, even with that situation all by itself, that I don't think Web3 solves everything. I don't think decentralization solves everything. I think it helps lead us to some of the ideals, that a lot of the original researchers and scientists who created the internet were striving for in the first place. And but ultimately it's really up to the decentralized apps and the protocols we choose to use, which ones end up being successful, which blockchains end up being successful, and who's building on those, and their incentives as well. Clearly there are financial incentives, we can't ignore that, but where there are incentives that also align with human rights, with greater access, with greater transparency, etc. Those are the things I'm bullish about.
Totally.
besides fun DeFi protocols, printing money,
Right.
with 2,000% APY. Like that's fun, but it's not why I'm here. That's a complete side thought. Um, I'm here for Orchid style projects that actually let you pay for stuff more privately, and potentially access technologies that otherwise your government doesn't want you to have access to, or the mafia down the street that runs your neighborhood doesn't want you to use.
Right. Yeah, this idea of aligning incentives, Web3 is really incredible in thinking about the tools that it gives end users to align incentives. And now we're seeing that's happening, right? People are realizing that they can form these communities together like DAOs that
Mm-hmm.
can allow them to represent some collective set of values. And then cryptographically, they can grow those communities. They can syndicate value out of those communities. That's a really powerful transformation of how we think about nonprofits, how we think about for profits. Like that is incredible because what it's doing is it's merging the users of a system and the owners of the system into one level playing field. And that's awesome. And from our standpoint at the lab, where we've started to get excited about it is that we're seeing a new form of digital activism, whereas you might be able to give over infrastructure or resources or time or expertise, that Web3 really
Mm-hmm.
allows people to hook in and to be part of those types of communities in a way that they've never been able to give before. So it really transforms the
Yeah.
idea of engagement. That said, we need to ensure that there are proper civics and values that help those types of communities really succeed. And I talk a lot about this with respect to inclusion, because this is, I think, a really important topic here. So when people talk about, let's say, the role of open source communities in democratizing technology development, I think there's a lot to be said for that from a standpoint of economics. The idea of open source technology was incredible, really, and how it provided ways for engineers to contribute without any financial compensation, but then also spawn these massive corporate opportunities as well. Right? That was day one of open source, and it's as a philosophy had those ideas in mind.
Yeah.
However, 20 years later, one of the things that we're now starting to grapple with is that open source communities are not necessarily equal communities. They are not necessarily inclusive communities. If you look at
Right.
how these types of projects are governed, some of them are very problematic because they tend to skew towards leaders that might be quite difficult, and there's toxic communities within open source projects that a lot of people don't want to talk about this, but it is a reality, and engineers will tell you that they will adopt technology, in large part, on the basis of its how effective it is, but then also how much they want to be part of that community. And if we've learned anything, especially over the last 18 months, is that for inclusion to happen, it needs to understand the elements of systemic racism and systemic exclusion, and then to take proactive steps. And the open source community is now realizing that, well, they necessarily haven't done that. And that when you look at the numbers, it's vastly skews towards white, male, young engineers creating the
Yeah.
technology that we all rely on in open source communities. So if Web3 says, okay, well, we've solved everything because it's all going to be open source and therefore it's going to be, inclusive and democratized and all the rest of it, well, you're asking, well, who's voting? Right? Who's actually
Yeah.
engaging in this process? And that is, I'm not sitting here being a Debbie Downer on this. I think that everything with Web3 can make that type of thing possible. It's just a question of if people want to step up and build those types of values and incentivize those types of outcomes at the beginning.
I will say one thing that gives me some hope there is that I think you have a much greater diversity of teams actually starting to build stuff, regardless of what the open source community usually looks like. Like I know a team based in, I think it's Nigeria. They're building a platform very much geared towards Africans to earn interest on stable coins and that sort of stuff on an inexpensive blockchain. So like they're doing all the things that they know that they would want out of a project. They're doing it themselves. So I that's one way where it's getting better. Certainly not solved. We only have a couple minutes here left, so I wanted to get your thoughts on 2022. What are you really excited about? What's Starling Lab working on that you hope maybe will deliver next year? Like, what are you looking forward to in 2022?
It's awesome because we now have a team that is in place that's full time. This has been a 3-year journey to put this together. And in June, we formally launched as a lab. And so each of those verticals that I talked about, history, law, and journalism, have anywhere from 10 to 20 projects that they're going to be launching in 2022. There's going to be grants that are
Wow.
written for journalists to engage with this technology, and we can learn together how it makes sense for them. We're hoping to do some reporting with them at arm's length so that they can get out there and start to road test some of this technology. And so that's really exciting. With lawyers, we have active cases that we're working on international accountability, looking specifically at the Syrian conflict and a lot of really critical work in doing preservation of war crimes evidence over there. And then finally, with historians, we continue to do really exceptional work with the Usc Show-Off Foundation and the preservation of testimonies that they have. We're also expanding beyond that to look at other types of conflicts. And in particular, we have really focused in on the 2020 protests around the George Floyd murder, and we are really excited to step up and preserve that critical moment in history that really we need to ensure that is properly documented so that people understand what a seismic moment that was. And so
Yeah.
that includes making sure, to your point, that we include folks with lived experience, could understand that conflict, and we keep those records with them. We keep the technology development with them. So that's a big part of our approach. So starlinglab.org is our website. Feel free to come over to it and to get involved. We're happy to take applications for grants, and we're hiring as well. So really happy to hear from any DWeb projects. If you've got exciting technology, we're really happy to hear you out and potentially test drive it together in the field.
Perfect. Jonathan, thanks so much for your time today. We went right up to your time limit. And everybody listening, I hope you really enjoyed this episode. And until next time, stay free.